So I just want to emphasize how proud I am of our association and what we've become as a movement, what we've become as an organization that is dedicated to being activists for action. And we've gone through so many changes, and it's so much reflected in this room, in that we're an organization that had less than 1,000 student members just a few years ago. We've got over 12,000 now. Thank you. We're an organization that used to be about learning about the UN, and that's great too. We still do that. It used to be about public education, and it always will be to some extent. And for many of our younger members who came up through the Model UN system, you've been learning and engaging with the UN for a long time. But right now as an organization, we're about the upload as well as the download. We're about sharing the individual perspectives of our members, the individual perspectives of our chapters, of our partners, into UN policy processes, and standing beside UN frontline workers, UN agencies, programs, and funds in executing the missions that they do. We're not just about learning about the UN, we're about taking action with it. And I would have to say that the thing that causes us to be successful isn't just that we're able to reach out to great model UNers and mobilize them and connect them. It's that there are individual issues, I think, that drive our affinity, drive our emotional connection, drive our values, and why we see something in the UN that connects with ourselves. And there are different issues for different people. We had great sessions this morning on human rights, on gender rights, on LGBT rights, and I can look across the country and find great communities within our membership who are mobilized by those issues. We talked about peace and security, and certainly the role of the UN in peace and security has been a driver for us. But I would say that global health, the role that the UN plays in dealing with issues and problems that, as the former Secretary General Kofi Annan used to say, problems without passports, is one of those key drivers. Is one of those things where we truly see the value of multilateralism, the value of the UN in solving problems. And we're so fortunate to have David Nabarro with us today, the UN Special Envoy on the Ebola response, who came up through the WHO system, who knows better than anybody the role of the UN in solving global pandemics and addressing them and reacting to them. And we could have no better person to introduce what will be a series of discussions on global health than David. Thank you.
Thank you. It's about a year and 2 months since the first person in the latest Ebola outbreak, a 2-year-old child in Guinea, developed fever, vomiting, and black poo, and this turned out to be the initial case of the current Ebola outbreak. During the subsequent few months, when we look back at the history, the numbers of cases rose slowly, but they were confused with other diseases. They were confused with cholera, confused with Lassa fever. And it wasn't until May of last year that it was clear that a bad outbreak was happening. And then in July and August last year, we thought we were in the middle of a really terrible catastrophe. I started work on this agenda. I was asked to do it by the Secretary General at the beginning of August. And I went straight from Kenya, where I was at the time when I received the call, to the WHO headquarters in Geneva. And I've been in these situations before, but I'd like to describe it to you. You start perceiving that there is a huge increase day by day in the numbers of people who are sick, in where they're coming from, and each hour or two you get a new piece of information that suggests that it is spreading perhaps to other countries like Nigeria, or it's spreading in numbers, and you ask yourself, how on earth are we going to deal with this? Because we started to look at the curves of the numbers of new cases who were appearing each week. And in those first 2 weeks of August, I remember sitting with the Director General of WHO and coming here and talking to the Secretary General. And we looked at each other and we said, this is doubling every 3 weeks. And when you've got an outbreak that is increasing like that in intensity, you are scared. And we weren't the only ones who were scared. The presidents of the governments affected by the outbreak were scared. The head of the Centers for Disease Control, Dr. Thomas Frieden, was scared. And in fact, many others were as well. Why were we scared? Because this disease is deadly. This disease is contagious. You don't have a very high cure rate, even if you offer the best possible care. But most importantly, we were scared because it looked like the outbreak was racing ahead of our collective ability to control it. This was still, remember, it was early August. So we started, as you do in these situations, to share our concerns. We shared our concerns with governments. We shared our concerns with the NGOs. Most importantly, we shared our concerns across the different parts of the United Nations. Number one, the Secretary General. Immediately he said, this is the kind of task that the United Nations has to deal with. The point that Chris just said. Diseases don't respect borders, so it has to be done together. And Dr. Margaret Chan, the head of the World Health Organization, came with me to see the Secretary General at the beginning of August. And between us, we said, we will do something we've never done before. We will set up a United Nations mission for Ebola, in which we bring all the different assets we've got and we make them available to the countries. But we knew we couldn't do it alone. We went to Washington. The Secretary General rang up the President. We went to see staff in the White House, staff in Health and Human Services, staff in USAID and other places. And we listened to your government say, yes, we're going to be with the people of West Africa. And we went to London, and we went to Paris. We went to Havana in Cuba. We went to as many different places as we could, looking for health people, looking for finance, looking for aircraft, looking for whatever was necessary to mount the most extraordinary response ever to this disease. Trying to build hospitals that could treat people with Ebola so that we'd got at least 2,000 beds and possibly many more than that, 4 or 5 times the number that existed when I started. So this became a test for the United Nations. It became something that the United Nations was able to do, and it became something that we did together with governments of all the major nations of the world and together with the leaders of many of the non-governmental organizations that we all know so well. We put right at the top of our agenda the need to enable people who were sick to get treated quickly so they didn't stay at home and infect their families and their friends. Because I'm sure you saw it in your newspapers, there were too many stories of people arriving to get treated and getting sick and then going home because they couldn't get admitted to a treatment center. And then we put in place, together with others, facilities to bury people safely and with dignity when they died, so they weren't infecting people at the time of death. And we worked with communities in this area, the size of France, to get them to consider changing their behaviors so that it reduced the level of the outbreak. By early January, instead of having 1,000 new cases a week, the number had fallen to just over 100. By the beginning of January, we had the beds, we had the safe burials, and most importantly, it looked as though the worst of the outbreak was over. We've still got a lot to do, because in all disease control and outbreak management exercises, the last 10% is always the hardest, and if you take your eye off it, then you lose. So we've got this last 10% to do. We've got lots of work with the governments who are in the lead, these wonderful presidents, Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia, Ernest Bai Koroma of Sierra Leone, and Alpha Conde of Guinea, as well as I.B. Keita of Mali, who did an amazing job as well. We will work with these presidents to finish it. We will continue to be supported by John Mahama, the President of Ghana, who has been such a fantastic ally in this work. But most importantly, we will bring the whole of the United Nations system to complete the job. It's the kind of experience that you can only have once in a lifetime. Me, still think of myself as a young doctor, but I'm not. Started out 35 years ago, working in the hills of Nepal, and then I've done lots of jobs since then. But just imagine to have, before you finish, the opportunity to be part of this amazing worldwide response. And now also with Helen Clark in the lead and Dr. Jim Kim, the President of the World Bank, be working also on recovery. So what have we learnt from this? First of all, health systems are absolutely critical for every country in the world to deal with these kinds of diseases that can come and all of a sudden destroy people's lives and livelihoods. More than 23,000 people affected by this disease. It's a tragedy. So we must continue to keep health strong within the Sustainable Development Goals and also within the work of the global movement of people fighting for development. Number two, it's only the United Nations system that can deal with these sorts of problems because you're dealing with multiple countries and relations between countries. National governments are key, but it's the collective of the national governments that make a difference. Thirdly, you do need to have money. We struggled on this one. We still are, because we have to raise money while we're doing the work. And so to get new funds to deal with these kinds of health emergencies is key. Number four, we must finance the World Health Organization properly. Its budget is less than the budget of your Centers for Disease Control. Its budget is less than the budget of a British district hospital, and it needs to be better resourced. Number five, we need to have good rules that determine how to deal with sickness and disease between countries, so that each nation is accountable for reporting when its people have infectious diseases and don't spread them from place to place. And then, just finally, we've got to recognize that illness is going to remain a threat, along with climate change, along with the kind of warfare that we have to deal with in the world today. that we have to put into our list of global threats emerging and unknown diseases. We don't see them very often, so we often don't think about them. But those of you who've worked in the health professions know that to have a strong defense against bad diseases is important. And there's one that's affecting all of you now. You've heard of superbugs, the kind of bugs that can't be dealt with by normal antibiotics. They're an example of the health threats that can affect humanity anywhere in the world. And so please, as you go about your work, think about health threats along with other threats to life as things that have to be factored into development and things that may come and hit you when you least expect them. So, last year and this year is putting the world community and the UN to the test with Ebola, and there will be other diseases like it. Let's make certain that we can end this outbreak without it going bad again. Let's make certain we can help these great countries that have been affected recover and get back and be strong again, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. And let's make sure that in future we have a system that can deal with these problems better and more efficiently, so that we don't feel ourselves having to invent while we do it. Let's make the system and get it in place, because we will need it again and again and again. And this time we've had a tragedy and it's been difficult, but it looks like it's coming right. Next time, let's get it before it gets bad. Thank you very much indeed for the chance just to look at you and be with you. Great.
All right, let's welcome questions. Right there in the red shirt and the, right there, you.
Take 5.
Certainly.
Yes, hello. I'm Carly Chavera, Global Environmental Politics Program, American University. Thank you so much for your remarks today. And, you know, you emphasized a lot the need for communication and coordination amongst nations, across nations with diseases. Reflecting on the international collaboration and response, do you feel that there needs to be any changes in the institutional structures of the global health regime, and how do you think the Ebola crisis has redefined, if at all, the mandate of the UN in the global health regime? Thank you.
Other questions? See, right, you, Gail?
Sorry. Good afternoon, Mr. Nabarro and the panel. My question to you is, you talked about Liberia and all the African countries. In another meeting, I heard how some of the American students here, when they are faced with other students, you know, from West Africa or other parts that have been stricken with Ebola, they have actually said, oh, I don't want to sit in class next to this one, or I don't want to sit in class next to that one. Mr. Nabarro, what do you think is the best way to communicate with our youth so that they truly do understand that you're not going to catch Ebola just because someone is from West Africa or some place that is connected with Ebola? Because that is really happening here.
Actually, on this side of the room, on the white shirt, blue suit on the far by the column.
Yes, hi. My name is Whatley, and I'm part of the UNA Chicago chapter. And I got a question in regards to global conflict issues. Do you think that global conflict issues can basically escalate on the crisis in Ebola due to the destabilization of governments in those 3 countries? Thank you.
Could it escalate?
Yes, exactly.
Conflict.
Yes, conflict. Exactly. We're going to take 2 more questions. Anyone from this side of the room, right there in the front row?
About the, first of all, my name is Septina from the Wake County chapter. Do you think that the U.S. response has been anemic in terms of the response by the leaders in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. I know you were complimenting their efforts, but do you really think it was complimentary or their performance in establishing these new procedures that you speak of, were they anemic?
Enthusiastic guy waving his hand.
Thank you, Mr. Nabarro, for your comments. My name is Jose Garcia, former board director for UNA Brooklyn. First of all, I have a comment that disagrees with something you said, which is that you say you're an old doctor. There's a saying that says you're as old as you feel. So if you feel that you're a young doctor, you're a young doctor. Don't let anyone else tell you that.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. I was fishing. Thank you for that.
Great. Okay, I think we can go ahead.
Oh, it's on. It's on. So the question that I do have is, you started off with the whole reason this task force was formed was from an analysis that said the outbreak was doubling every 3 weeks. And you had concluded your remarks that you wanted to catch it before it became a statistic. And the fact is historically we make decisions based on data, right? You know, as Stalin says, you know, 1 death is a tragedy, but 1,000 is a statistic. So to your point, your closing remark, how exactly are we going to catch these trends? Because usually it's through data analysis that we realize, oh, this is a problem.
Excellent questions.
Thank you very much. So this is about 2 hours worth of questions or more. But that's, in a way, why working in this place is such a gas. Because every minute of every hour of every day, we're dealing with things that are the subject of a course of 10 lectures in some kind of teaching institution. I mean, you will always find on every issue, madam, that the cooperation between nations is not of the level that is required for global governance of an issue. That, by definition, is what's happening in our world today. The United Nations, which is our fundamental system for global governance in the world today, is as strong as its members allow it to be, and the members have considerable anxiety about vesting too much authority in a supra-governmental body. But for dealing with issues of global health, where you have an infectious agent that can move from country to country, ideally you require a supra-governmental authority. Personally, I don't believe that the nations will allow the institutional structures in the global health regime to have more power than they have at the moment. But I might be wrong. So what I would encourage you to do is to see what happens within the World Health Organization's governing bodies, and particularly whether or not the revised international health regulations, which is the mechanism through which global governance of health issues is done, to see whether that undergoes further reforms or not and ends up with more teeth. You could argue in abstract that actually the world needs as strong governance on global health and global health security as it has on issues of peace and security and violence of the kind that feature in Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. But at the moment, we're not there. So I think the Ebola crisis will provoke more thought, but I'm not sure that the world's nations are yet ready to have more power in the UN system on this issue. Number 2, I think that the stigma, madam, that has been demonstrated towards people from West Africa because they happen to come from West Africa is totally unacceptable. It's like what I found in the late 1980s when people from Uganda would be stigmatized because there happened to be quite a lot of HIV in the places around Lake Victoria. I think that whenever you hear of this stigma, you have to ask, what is the underlying cause? And yes, it might be to do with lack of knowledge and ignorance, but I'm afraid sometimes it is for other reasons. So I think that we should totally confront this kind of behavior in a robust way. The only trouble is that we saw the same kind of prejudicial behavior by some governments or by leaders of state governments not far from here. And so I'm afraid we have still a long way to go to deal with this kind of unacceptable stigmatization that has been very damaging to the people from this region. Now, there are many issues where I believe conflicts can escalate health challenges. I have seen this before with polio, I have seen it with cholera, and it could well happen with a disease like Ebola. Just at the moment, there is not only peace in the part of Africa that has Ebola, but there's also a real political consensus between different political factions that they will work together for dealing with this problem. And I would like to put to you that one of the crusades that we all need to work on for the future is the notion that we will seek peace for the sake of health. Health of children, health of women, health of men, because you can only really deal with major health issues in an atmosphere where doctors and nurses can go about their work, in an atmosphere where there is not fear, where there is peace. Number 4, I will not agree that the US response has been anemic. I've got figures on the cash that's been put in by the US, the numbers of people supplied by the US, and I believe that it was powerful and brave. Nearly 3,000 troops, but 10,000 civilians, and a huge amount of money. And actually, I wish the rest of the world had come in with the same kind of force and the same kind of commitment and the same style as the US. Your ambassador in Monrovia, Deborah Malak, took the leadership on this, together with President Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia, to make certain that the US came in support of the Liberian government and people and not to boss them around. It was good. It wasn't anemic. It was full-blooded. To Mr. Garcia. And perhaps I have to move here into something that is reasonable to say as a last remark. The kind of work we do depends a lot on data, but also depends on us being able to access very experienced people who've done work before. And I'm always pleased when I find that the UN is able to call on experts from all over the world. Why do you need expertise? Because often in a difficult situation, you're not mechanically studying lines on graphs and saying, oh, this looks bad. You're depending on this instrument here and this instrument here. Heart, because that's where the feelings are, and gut, because that's where your experience tends to settle. So it's a combination of this one, and this one being used. And Mr. Garcia, to catch these things early, you need to have a good brain, a feeling heart, and a strong gut. Thank you very much indeed.